ever tried rebuilding something, after a real disaster? Like, imagine it's not just your house, but the entire world economy.
Oof, yeah.
That's the challenge these folks faced after World War II. And trust me, the story is way wilder than you might think.
It really is. The world was desperate, I mean, truly desperate for a sense of order. Some way to rebuild and avoid another economic nightmare like after the First World War.
Right, total chaos.
Yeah.
And that's where the Battle of Bretton Woods comes in.
Exactly.
This book dives into this, pivotal conference where the fate of global finance was literally up for grabs.
The stakes don't get much higher.
No kidding. We're talking like the birth of institutions we still hear about every day, the IMF, the World Bank. Huge is an understatement. But what makes this book so fascinating is that it doesn't just hit you with dry economic theory. It's like behind the scenes with the personalities driving these massive decisions.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially John Maynard Keynes and this Harry Dexter White. Talk about a clash of economic titans, right?
Right, Clash of Titans is a great way to put it.
It's like reading a political thriller, but about money. And the setting itself is intriguing, This wasn't some boring government building.
Oh, no, not at all.
They held this crucial conference at the Mount Washington Hotel. It's this luxurious resort tucked away in the New Hampshire mountains.
Sounds fancy.
Oh, it was. Imagine 400 rooms, Italian marble, even a bowling alley. For real.
Makes you wonder what those delegates were thinking. Negotiating the future of the world in between bowling matches and cocktails.
Right. It's kind of a wild thought. And speaking of culture clashes, the book mentions there were over 700 delegates from 44 countries, all gathered in this grand hotel.
Wow.
Imagine those conversations, the negotiations, the potential for someone to completely misunderstand.
I bet there were some stories there.
Oh, there are.
Yeah.
There's one about a local hermit who mistook some Chinese delegates for Japanese spies.
Oh, no. You can't make this stuff up.
Right. So we've got this lavish resort, a cast of characters from literally around the world, all gathered to prevent economic chaos.
Yeah.
But digging into the book, something in the intro really jumped out at me. Harry Dexter White, this American economist, major player at Bretton Woods, he left out his entire life before Harvard in his Who's Who entry.
Almost like he wanted to hide it.
Exactly. Like he wanted to erase his past.
That's definitely a detail that makes you curious. Speaks volumes, really, about White's character. Ambitious, driven, but maybe a little insecure about his background.
Makes sense.
He was the son of a peddler, you see. A far cry from those hallowed halls of Harvard.
And yet he rose through the ranks crazy fast.
Right.
The book describes him as the intellectual bedrock of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau.
Yeah, Morgenthau. More of a big picture guy, from what I gather.
Yeah, sounds like it. While White was the one actually translating the economic theories into, policies.
Precisely. White could take these complex economic ideas and turn them into something actionable. He was known for churning out these policy proposals. Incredibly efficient, absolutely essential to Morgenthau, who, let's be honest, probably relied on White a lot to navigate the world of international finance.
But then, the plot thickens. Remember those hints of suspicion we mentioned earlier?
How could I forget?
There's this whole thing about a Soviet rug found in White's home. And that, my friend, is where things get really, really interesting.
Oh boy, here we go.
Because this is where those allegations of White being involved with Soviet intelligence really come into play.
Wait, seriously?
The book dives right into this controversy, presenting evidence from Whittaker Chambers. He was this former Soviet courier who defected to the U.S. Claims White was passing info to the Soviets. No way! This guy who helped shape the entire post-war economic order might have been a Soviet sympathizer.
Hold on, this is huge. It really is a wild story. And to be fair, the book lays out all sides, doesn't try to hide the complexity. There's also this whole thing with the Venona Project.
Venona Project, remind me.
Right, so it was this top secret U.S. effort. They were trying to decrypt Soviet messages, right? And some of what they found seemed to back up those claims about White.
So, actual proof.
It's not that cut and dry, unfortunately. That's what makes it so tough. Historians are still going back and forth about it all these years later.
Makes sense. But still, what are we supposed to believe? Was White actually a Soviet spy? Or is there something else going on?
$1 million question, for sure. Some historians say, look, the information White supposedly passed wasn't that big of a deal.
Interesting. So maybe he wasn't this mastermind double agent.
Maybe, maybe not. But here's the thing. Even if he wasn't this, full-blown spy, the implications are still massive, just the suspicion alone. Having someone maybe with Soviet sympathies at the core of the U.S. Treasury at such a crucial moment.
Whoa. That's a whole other layer to this whole thing.
Right. It makes you wonder how much those suspicions affected everything else going on. The start of the Cold War, all of it.
It really does. Makes you think about those hidden agendas behind, like, every major historical event.
For sure.
But, okay, we spent a lot of time on White.
To the rabbit hole, for sure.
Total rabbit hole. What about Keynes, then? He seems like a completely different character, right?
Oh, totally. John Maynard Keynes. This guy was an absolute giant in economics. Sharp wit, elegant writer, and his ideas, groundbreaking. The book does a great job of capturing how different these two men were. White, remember, came from humble beginnings. Keynes. He was a true product of that British intellectual elite. Eton, Cambridge.
Wow. Talk about privilege, huh?
He even spent some time being tutored by Alfred Marshall.
Wait, the Alfred Marshall? Yeah. The founder of modern economics, Marshall.
The one and only.
Wow. Can you imagine trying to debate economics with the guy who taught the guy?
Right.
But Keynes wasn't just stuck in some ivory tower, right? He was out there in the real world, saw how things worked, especially during World War I.
Oh, absolutely. That experience had a huge impact on him. He saw how Britain, once this powerful economic force, was becoming more and more reliant on, guess what, the U.S. dollar.
Oh, I bet that didn't sit well.
Not one bit. This shift in the balance of power really bothered him, you can tell.
And it fed into his whole economic philosophy, didn't it? The book talks about how the Great Depression forced him to rethink all those traditional economic theories. Even some of his own earlier beliefs, right?
Totally. It was a chaotic time. Keynes realized the old playbook didn't work anymore. There's this quote I love. He said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?"
Oof. Mic drop moment. Takes a certain kind of person to admit they were wrong and adapt.
Right. And that's where his most famous work comes in, the general theory of employment, interest, and money.
The big one.
The one that changed everything.
So, what do you say? What was so revolutionary?
Keynes argued that governments can't just sit on the sidelines, especially during a crisis. He challenged that whole "the market will fix itself" idea, said, no, governments need to step in, stimulate demand, make sure everyone has a job.
Which, looking back, seems kind of obvious.
Right. But back then, it was a radical idea. It completely went against the dominant economic thinking of the time. But it changed how governments approached economics, not just in Britain, but worldwide.
Wow.
Even today, his ideas from the general theory are still debated. That's how impactful his work was.
So we had these two giants, White and Keynes, both with their own, baggage, experiences, ideas for how the world should work after the war.
And those ideas, completely opposed. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a battle of ideologies.
With incredibly high stakes, right? I mean, the whole world was watching, recovering from a devastating war, hoping for some stability. Okay, so let's talk about this showdown at Bretton Woods. We've got these two completely different visions for the future of global finance. What were the main differences between White's plan and what Keynes was proposing?
Well, you got to remember, White was all about protecting American interests. He was pushing for a system with the U.S. dollar at the center of everything.
Makes sense. The U.S. was in a powerful position coming out of the war.
Exactly. White believed that the U.S. could basically be the bank for the world, provide everyone with a stable currency, backed by gold, of course.
So make the dollar the world's go-to currency, but back it with gold to keep things, legit.
Exactly. He called it a dollar-centric system. Catchy, right?
Definitely rolls off the tongue. But I'm guessing Keynes wasn't thrilled about handing that much power to the U.S.
You're catching on. Keynes was always wary of giving too much control to any one country, even a close ally like the U.S. He'd seen how that could go wrong, create instability.
And he had a totally different idea, right?
Yeah.
Something about a clearing union. What was that all about?
Okay, so imagine a global bank, but instead of dealing with people, it manages trade between countries.
Okay, I'm following.
Each country would have an account with this international clearing union using a special international currency for all their transactions.
So like a global checking account.
Pretty much. It was designed to prevent those massive trade imbalances, where one country ends up with huge surpluses and another is drowning in debt.
Right. Kind of levels the playing field. So if it was such a brilliant idea, why didn't it happen?
Well, remember those power dynamics we talked about?
Oh, right. The U.S. held all the cards.
Bingo. They had the money, the influence. They weren't so keen on handing over control to a global organization, even one as clever as Keynes' clearing union.
So it was a power play.
Let's call it a strategic maneuver.
Nicely put. So White gets his way. Dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. But decades later, did it work? Did Bretton Woods actually deliver the stability and prosperity they were hoping for?
It's complicated. On the one hand, the Bretton Woods system did usher in a period of relative stability and growth. International trade boomed, and for a while there, the world avoided another devastating depression.
So a win for Team Bretton Woods.
Not so fast. The system had its weaknesses, big ones, putting so much pressure on the US dollar that was bound to create problems.
Right, eventually the cracks start to show.
Exactly. By the early 1970s, the whole system was starting to unravel. The U.S. faced its own economic troubles, and boom, they ditched the gold standard. And that was the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement as we know it.
Wow, so a grand experiment that ultimately failed.
I wouldn't call it a failure. It achieved some of its goals for a time. It just couldn't last forever. And you know what's fascinating? Even Harry Dexter White, Mr. Dollar-centric system himself, started having second thoughts.
No way, really.
Yep. The book mentions this unpublished essay he wrote later in life. He sounds disillusioned, questioning if Bretton Woods actually achieved what he'd set out to do.
Wow, talk about regretting your life choices. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. History is rarely neat and tidy. The Bretton Woods Agreement, it was a product of its time, shaped by personalities, by politics, by circumstances, and its legacy, still debated today.
So what are we supposed to take away from all this?
That there are no easy answers, right? But the story of Bretton Woods, it reminds us that the world is constantly changing, and that even the best laid plans
It can go totally haywire.
Exactly. It also highlights the importance of collaboration, of finding common ground even when the stakes are high. Because who knows, maybe we're due for a new Bretton Woods, a new system to tackle the challenges of the 21st century.
Now that's a thought. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that, learner. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and often messy world of Bretton Woods. Be sure to check out the Battle of Bretton Woods if you want to learn more. It's a wild ride full of intrigue, big personalities, and lessons we're still grappling with today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.